It takes a brave and independent mindset to go tiny. If you are trying to figure out your tiny pivot, this podcast is here to inspire and connect you with the other unconventional, gritty, inspirational people within this community. I am Laura Lynch, your tiny house friend and host. On this show, we are always going to come back to money because as a financial planner, this is the question I hear the most. How do I make this work for me financially? Well, that's my jam, so jump in, let's go. New episodes drop every Thursday. Hey everybody, Laura here. So September 14th and 15th, I was in San Jose, California at Tiny Fest Bay Area. I had not been in that area of California since 1999 when I was in the Air Force studying Russian there at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. And it was great. I got to catch up with an old friend and hang out there on the Santa Clara County Fairgrounds for 2 days. There were lots of people that came to the festival. There were some fun entertainers there and lots of tiny home builders. And I bought a cool basket. It was a really fun experience. And like my experience in Colorado back in July, I recorded an episode about the Tiny House Festival in Colorado. There were a lot of people trying to figure out the two things, the where part and the money part. So I was excited to, talk to people about both of those ideas, kind of sending them over to the Tiny Home Industry Association website for the resource map that I work on, as well as talking about tiny home financing with pretty much everybody. So lots and lots of questions about tiny home financing. So I'm definitely going to have to work on some more content on this topic. So working on gathering some more resources there because I certainly don't know everything there is to know, though that's something that I've talked about on a number of different episodes before. So those two things were the same in terms of the topics and conversations that I had. Handed out a lot of podcast stickers. So hello to anyone who met me there at Tiny Fest in California and picked up a sticker. Thank you so much for listening. Super excited to have you here. And also I got to hand out the financial freedom calculator, helping people get their money organized so that they can move towards tiny living. So if you haven't checked that out yet, that's at altamericandream.com. This is something that I'm really focused on, helping people just get their money organized and understanding how they take those financial steps forward. So I'm going to be a little nerdy in this episode. So hello to all my friendly nerds out there. You know who you are. You know what occurred to me while I was at Tiny Fest was some of the sort of signs of the change happening in the tiny home industry. So back many years ago, when the first pioneers built a tiny home on wheels, they were doing it just as people that were out there trying to figure out how to live small and how to have a roof over their head. In reality, humans have been living in tiny spaces since humans existed. The invention of the large McMansions or, conventionally sized homes that we see today is kind of a more modern wealth-based phenomenon. So certainly humans have been living tiny for all of humanity. And so seeing this industry or this business being created out of this concept is quite fascinating. And so as I was thinking through the conversations that I overheard while I was there at Tiny Fest, I was thinking about the evolution of this new industry that is cropping up. And so I took a little Google over to Investopedia and looked at two topics. One is the industry life cycle, and the other is adopter categories, which I thought was two relevant topics for what's happening in tiny living. And I thought we would explore those today. Now, these are, pretty nerdy topics and don't really speak to the individual experience of creating affordable roof over their head or doing a lifestyle that's quite sustainable. But it is interesting from an industry perspective, because the more that happens in terms of the industry life cycle, the more perhaps accessible this lifestyle becomes for others. So that's why I wanted to talk about it. So industry life cycle phases kind of relates to the business cycle that I studied a lot in my financial studies. And really it talks about the introduction phase, the growth phase of an industry, the maturity phase, and the decline phase. This is kind of like what we see in the financial world, where we have these growth and peak and trough phase of the business cycle. But when we think about the introduction phase in any industry, it's a time of startup. And this is where new businesses are coming into the industry. They're trying to do early marketing. They're spending a lot of marketing, spending a lot of money on marketing and on development of new products. They're probably not profitable. People are entering the industry and exiting the industry. They're failing out. Everything is very fragmented. There's no sort of uniform way of things being done. And we have seen this in the past in the tiny home industry. There were a lot of builders that started building tiny homes that no longer exist. There haven't been standard building codes for the entirety of the industry. It's very fragmented and siloed, and the buyer of tiny homes has to be very savvy and figure out who is going to be good to purchase from. There's a lot of due diligence required. Everything is a little bit more complicated in that introduction phase. And so we've really seen that in that it has been a struggle for people to make this transition into tiny living, because it's been hard to find or figure out who's a good quality builder, and what is the value of tiny homes these days, and where do I put one, and how do I purchase one, because there isn't a mortgage product for all tiny homes. So all of this has been signals of the introduction phase of this industry. So a lot is happening, though, in terms of moving past introduction and into growth. So the growth phase, consumers have come to understand the value of the new offering, business, or industry, and demand grows rapidly. I would say, from my experience at some of the tiny house festivals that I've been to, that demand is growing rapidly, that consumers understand the value of living a simpler, smaller life, and they are demanding it. And so it also says on this Investopedia article that a handful of important players usually become apparent, and they compete to establish a new share of the market. And so we see some of the builders of ADUs and tiny homes starting to become more prominent. And so they probably aren't in competition because there's a lot of demand, but they're definitely starting to up level the product that they're creating, and they're really getting competitive in the way that they talk about their product in terms of, what kind of materials that they use, and they're being very salesy, in my opinion, sometimes with the way that they talk about their homes. And when you go to see these demo homes at the shows, they look like mini versions of super luxe standard American home models that we see, instead of like the handcrafted, unique homes of the past. So very interesting to see this growth phase. Business processes are improved and geographical expansion is common. We're seeing home builders sell in multiple states. They're hiring bigger teams. They're changing their products to be more adaptive to what's being legalized in terms of ADUs, as an example. They're trying to reduce costs by creating larger facilities to manufacture their homes. So a lot of that growth phase is starting to be clear in the tiny home industry from my view.
On Less House More Moola, we hear so many stories of people living unconventional lives. Each of them is literally building their alt-American dream. Are you tired of putting your dreams on hold because of money? Well, let's fix it. I have a two-part offering that is here to help you. First, I'm going to give you access to my financial freedom calculator so that you'll understand your numbers and have a tangible starting point. This is free. And then second, we'll book a session to figure out your finances so that you can live your alt-American dream as soon as possible. This is paid. Why am I giving you something for free? Because I'm passionate about empowering people to choose an unconventional path. So let's work together to figure out money so that you will know that you've officially taken action on your plans. This offering is for you if you're unsure of your cost of living or how much savings you might need. You don't know what money move to make next. You dream of an unconventional life built on your terms. You're seeking a permanent solution and not a one-time motivational boost. You want to learn about money from someone who shares your interest in breaking away from the norm. So what do you think? Are you tired of starting sentences with someday when I? Then go to altamericandream.com and get the financial freedom calculator.
Now, I think that one of the important things that I really noticed in California was how many investor types were there at the festival. So it wasn't just individuals there trying to figure out, how do I buy a tiny house and where do I put it? It was actually a lot of people that were coming in to say, hey, what is the business opportunity here? And so in the vendor booth next to me, there was a company that had a scale model of a community. They're manufacturing tiny homes that get rolled off of, semis into place in a permanent way in a community. And so they were basically looking for people who had land and investment dollars to create tiny home communities. And there was, and didn't really get into the specifics or hear all the specifics, but there was an investor and revenue sharing opportunity there. And so I thought it was really interesting how many people flocked to that booth over time who were coming there investment opportunity minded. And so when we think about the life cycle phases of any industry, and especially like we think of tech, right? So when a new tech firm gets started, it's a couple of guys in a garage like Microsoft, right? And then in time, we have investors coming to the table, angel investors, venture capital investors who bring dollars into that company, and that company starts to grow very rapidly. And then ultimately those founders get bought out over time. And so it's interesting to see that there are these new concepts of these tiny home communities that are being pitched essentially at a festival, and people with money, investors, are coming to buy into these concepts. And then ultimately the people with the original idea will get to, profit in the long term. And so that really reminds me of tech companies and the fact that we are no longer in introduction phase of tiny home construction. We are really in growth phase in terms of investors coming to the table. And there were a lot of investor conversations happening at that festival. So I thought that was kind of curious and interesting. I would say that was probably more prevalent in California than Colorado, perhaps because of the length of time that California has been legalizing tiny homes and some of the new legislation that's taken place in California, as well as the length of time of the housing crisis in California, and the fact that the housing need there has been going on for longer than Colorado. Colorado's prices have certainly skyrocketed, but it's been a more recent phenomenon than California. So very interesting to see that sign of the growth phase. And of course, as this industry continues to grow, there will be opportunity for money to be made for sure, because there are so many people, kind of getting on board. Which brings us over to this other idea of adopter categories. Again, another sort of nerdy perspective on what I saw there in California. And adopter categories is a concept that, again, we think of, in terms of tech or other innovations. And that is that we have innovators. Those are people who come to the new technology or the new idea very quickly. They come to it simply because the idea is new. So innovators, according to Investopedia, tend to take risks more readily and are more venturesome. So there were people quite a long time ago who were in the early 2000s or maybe even earlier who were into building a tiny home on wheels. They took risks in order to do it. It really was a new concept that nobody had heard of. And there were some folks who, started blogging about it or making videos about it or having podcasts about it, right? These are the innovators in the tiny home space in the way that we see it today. Those folks have been, are the pioneers of the industry. They're the ones we look to for the history of what has happened. They're the leaders in, the organizations who are making inroads in legislation. They're the people who have the largest communities and followings in this space. So we are all very grateful for them because they led the way and they created this opportunity. Then we have the early adopters. So the early adopters create opinions. So when we think about the HGTV influencers that we know of that are in the tiny house space, they have created the opinion of tiny home living that we all have today. They have propelled the trends. So they took on this new technology and they were interested in being ahead of the curve. So this is very interesting. I feel a little like an early adopter, even though probably the years wouldn't indicate I was an early adopter, but I was interested in doing something different. And so I feel like that early adopters are there because not because it's a new idea, just because it's new, but more because they want to be ahead of the curve. So we're so grateful to those early adopters. They're the ones who have created the media that has propelled the movement. And so we are excited that folks took tiny living and grabbed it and ran with it. But I think what we're seeing now, flooding the gates at Tiny Fest or the Colorado Tiny House Festival, is the early majority, because the early majority came to this idea not because it was cool, but because of its utility and practical benefits. So the early majority understand now that tiny living can be a path to financial freedom. They understand it can be a path to sustainability. They understand that it can simplify their lives. They are there because it makes sense for them. And so that's where we see the early majority entering the tiny living space. And as they're coming, they're bringing the same questions and pushing the same issues, and ultimately are going to cause the trend and the movement to move forward because there's going to be so many of them. So early majority is part of the majority, right? So it's a huge influx of people who are adopting this idea and trying to implement it in their lives, and their voice will be loud because there are a lot of them. So I think that's an exciting thing to see. The growth of these festivals, the growth of the channels is showing how many people realize that this can be a help to them in their complex lives. And so they are going to be asking the same questions of their municipalities, of their, zoning folks, of their, of the people who make decisions in the communities in which they live. They're going to be asking these same questions en masse, which will help to both ruffle feathers in terms of sort of, causing change to happen, but also will reinforce the change. So I'm excited to kind of see that trend and to look at it through the lens of these frameworks that have proven themselves out time and time again. And so we know that the tiny home movement has gotten some serious steam if we have investors that are looking at it all the time. And we also have the early majority showing up to the table trying to figure out, how do I buy a tiny house? What is my financing pathway and where can I put it? These two things need a lot of work on them. And so this early majority hopefully will continue to be resilient and push through these questions. So I had a great time, like I said, at Tiny Fest. I am figuring out what my travel schedule will be in the future and what festivals that I'm going to be headed to. I hope this recap, nerdy though it was helpful to you to understand kind of how I'm viewing the industry as being important for the individuals of us that are just trying to adopt this lifestyle. And for sure, if you are one of those investor types, there are definitely opportunities out there to create community, and people are in search of community. And if you're in the early majority just wanting to have a simpler, more sustainable life, and you're just trying to figure out the money part and the where, I'm certainly here to help. My financial freedom calculator is at altamericandream.com. I talked about this with a lot of people there at the festival. So make sure you get in there and put in all of your financial details in that secure financial planning tool so that you can get a good picture of where you stand financially so you can make that movement forward. And again, welcome to any new listeners. Super excited to have you following Tiny Fest. And next week, I will be talking to one of the volunteers at Tiny Fest who has a great tiny story. So make sure that you subscribe to this podcast so you will not miss next week's episode. And I have actually quite a few people from Tiny Fest that are going to be on the episodes coming up. So I was really excited to connect with people living the life and doing what we all are aiming to do. So make sure you check out those future episodes. Thanks so much for listening. Can't wait to talk to you next time. Hey, thank you for taking the time to listen to Less House More Moola. I have another free resource on my website for you, the Unconventional Values Quiz. In just 2 minutes, you can pinpoint your style of freedom seeker, security guardian, adventure enthusiast, or community builder. Check it out at thetinyhouseadvisor.com. And one more thing. Podcasts don't have algorithms like social media does. They only grow by word of mouth and reviews. If this podcast is helpful to you, would you please post a review on your podcast app and tell a friend who is trying to live a values-based life? It would totally make my day.
Please see the show notes for important disclosure regarding the Tiny House Advisor LLC and this episode.